Hello and welcome to the conservation of biodiversity. So most scientists, or let's just say most environmental scientists, believe that we are in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. We're going to talk about the Earth has had 5 major mass extinctions, and we'll talk about what's the definition of a mass extinction. But because of this idea that we are losing biodiversity fast, we need to talk, obviously, in AP Environmental Science about the conservation, like why are we losing biodiversity and the conservation of biodiversity. So the conservation of genetic diversity is important because populations with low diversity are, number one, at higher risk of extinction when the environment changes, and the environment is always changing. And populations with low diversity are also prone to inbreeding depression, which is a biology term. So what's inbreeding depression? Well, inbreeding depression results in reduced fitness because offspring have a greater chance of receiving 2 copies of a faulty allele. The depression means in terms of population numbers. When I say fitness here, I'm talking fitness in terms of natural selection, meaning a population's fit to its environment. So when you have a small gene pool, you end up with a greater chance of inheriting 2 recessive faulty alleles from your parents, which will give you the recessive phenotype, which may be detrimental to your environmental fitness. Low genetic diversity within a population can be the result of natural events, like a natural population bottleneck, possibly due to a natural disaster, like a hurricane, a flood, a volcanic eruption. Or low genetic diversity can be due to human actions, such as habitat loss, hunting, overharvesting, or something like that. Extinction occurs when the last member of a species dies. Major extinction events are classified by a loss of at least 75% of all extant species within a 2 million year period. And I had mentioned earlier that we were going to talk about what does it mean to have a mass extinction. That's what we're talking about. At least 75% of all living species die within a 2 million year period. Now, 2 million years it sounds like a really long time in human terms, but in geologic terms, 2 million years is actually very short. There have been 5 major extinction events in the Earth's history, and based on the current rate of species extinction, which is estimated to be about 1,000 times higher than background extinction, many scientists believe we're in the 6th mass extinction. This, unfortunately, is the only one with an anthropogenic cause, meaning it's caused by man, and the other 5 were all natural events. So when I say background rate of extinction, your book actually explains what this is, but species naturally go extinct. That's just a natural process. But the rate of species extinction, which we call the background extinction, due to just natural loss of fitness due to environmental change, is fairly slow. When we're talking about background versus current extinction rates, we're about 1,000 times higher than we should be. The IUCN categorizes a species as one of the following: data deficient, meaning we don't have reliable data to assess the species conservation status; extinct, meaning that the species was known to exist as recently as the year 1500, but the species does not exist today; threatened, which means it's at a high risk for extinction in the future; near threatened, which means it's very likely to become threatened in the future; and of least concern, which means the species is widespread and abundant. Now, notice that these IUCN categories are not the same as the Endangered Species Act. There's no endangered here. This is 2 different lists. So IUCN is one that is an international list. It can also be used, obviously, by U.S. agencies, although we tend to use endangered species list, and we'll get more into that as this presentation goes on. But the IUCN maintains something called a red list, and the red list lists species according to these 5 categories. So according to these categories, approximately 13% of birds, 25% of mammals, and 41% of amphibians are now considered threatened. Amphibians are at most risk due to a variety of factors, which are outlined in your book. Amphibians kind of get a double whammy since they're both lung breathers and skin breathers. They absorb land toxins and aquatic toxins, and a lot of those toxins can pass in through their thin membranous skin, which is hard for them. Additionally, amphibians are experiencing lots of habitat loss, so they're kind of getting a double whammy. To understand the value of ecosystems, we have to consider both intrinsic and instrumental values of the system. So an intrinsic value of an ecosystem exists independent of any benefit that it may provide to humans, meaning its worth doesn't relate to humans. That's what we're talking about in intrinsic value. The belief in the intrinsic value of an ecosystem may derive from a religious view or a philosophic view, but it leads to the feeling of a moral obligation to protect and preserve wild spaces. The instrumental value of an ecosystem stems from its worth as an instrument or tool that can be used to accomplish a goal, and that, of course, is in relation to humans. Instrumental values include things like crops, lumber, and pharmaceutical drugs that may be developed from wild species. Instrumental values can also be referred to as ecosystem services. And you heard about these way back in the first semester. We're going to kind of delve into those ecosystem services one more time. When calculating the instrumental value of an ecosystem, we must consider 5 categories. And these are all things that ecosystems provide to humans, because this is, again, instrumental value, which means it's something of worth to humans. Provisions, regulating services, support systems, resilience, and cultural services. All right, so and again, ecosystem services. Let's talk about provisions. Provisions are goods produced by ecosystems that humans can directly use. These include things like lumber, food crops, medicinal plants, natural rubber, and fur. Regulating services, again, ecosystem services. Natural ecosystems help to stabilize climate, serve as carbon sinks, regulate biogeochemical and hydrologic cycles. Now, some of these may seem like they don't have applicability to humans, but they absolutely do. All of those things would directly impact humans if the ecosystem was not functioning to stabilize those things. Support systems. Ecosystems provide a habitat for pollinator species such as bees, butterflies, and bats. They provide a habitat for natural predators of pest species, especially like bats that are eating agricultural pests. Intact ecosystems provide the habitat for those guys. And intact ecosystems provide filtration for surface and groundwater reserves. Again, all of these directly impact human activities. Resilience. Resilience is dependent upon species diversity. The higher the diversity, the more resilient the ecosystem. And resilient ecosystems are better able to withstand environmental change. So for all of these services that ecosystems are providing, intact ecosystems, meaning ones that have not been fragmented or negatively impacted by humans, have a greater resistance and therefore can provide greater benefits to humans. Finally, we have cultural services. Cultural services for humans include aesthetic benefits, meaning it just provides beauty, and humans actually are medically shown to have lower blood pressure and lower stress when in natural environments. Ecosystems provide recreational benefits to humans and scientific research opportunities. The estimated monetary value of the goods and services that intact ecosystems provide to humans annually is estimated at $30 trillion. That's an awful lot of money. It's also things that can't easily be replaced by mechanized processes. Like, you know, how are you going to recreate the hydrologic system or recreate biogeochemical cycles? Ecosystems basically regulate our climate and filter our water and stabilize life on Earth. When those things are gone, we have to somehow recreate those, or we're living in a broken environment. So it's not just monetary value, but it's like stabilization of the world, the planet on which you live. The 2005 UN Millennium Ecosystem Assessment concluded that of the 24 ecosystem services surveyed, 15 of those 24 were found to be declining or were being used at an unsustainable rate, meaning that if they weren't declining at that moment, they were in danger of declining in the near future. This is not good. So why? We know that biodiversity is declining. Let's figure out why. So causes of declining biodiversity, the number one cause is habitat loss. So species with narrow or specific ranges where they only can live or like to live within a narrow or specific range are at the highest risk of population decline. Habitat alteration. So when we're talking about habitat loss, that means the habitat goes away. I mean, obviously, it becomes something else, like a forest into a subdivision, or a wetland into a shopping mall. That's habitat loss. But you can also do habitat alteration, where you're changing the nature of the habitat. Let's say you're chopping down a forest and it's becoming a grassland, or you're chopping down a grassland and going to agriculture. Now, there are still species that can live there, but the habitat's been altered in such a way that it can cause a decline in biodiversity as well. So habitat loss and habitat alteration are causes of declining biodiversity. Deforestation is also a cause, although it's a much bigger cause in developing nations than it is in North America and Europe. In North America and Europe, forest reserves are actually increasing, and that is due to legislation and conservation ethics in the 20th century. But in developing nations, they're still actively cutting down their forests, particularly for agriculture. 70% of woodland, shrubland, which we also call a Mediterranean chaparral biome, has been lost. 50% of our world's grasslands, 30% of the world's deserts have been lost or degraded, and only 8% of the coral reefs that were alive in the 1970s were still alive in 2012. Coral reefs have been hit very hard, and we've talked about that when we talked about water pollution. We'll talk about it again when we hit climate change. When a habitat size is reduced, species decline through a variety of different processes. Smaller habitats contain fewer niches, and those fewer niches support fewer species, so you have a loss of biodiversity. Smaller habitats also contain fewer resources, which increases intra-specific competition. Again, with intra-specific competition, we have winners and losers, and those members of the population that are most fit to that environment will survive and reproduce, and the ones that are not will die off. Smaller habitats contain less diversity in abiotic conditions. And what I mean by that is in any habitat, you're going to have areas that differ in temperature, humidity, and things like that. So let's contrast like a warm, low altitude area along with a cooler, high altitude area, both within the same habitat for a species. But when we reduce that species range, or when we make that habitat smaller, species that require differing seasonal conditions or larger ranges with different abiotic conditions are going to suffer. Smaller habitats also increase exposure to potentially harmful species. There's an example that I'm going to use both here and a little bit later on. There's what we call the edge effect. The greater the fragmentation of the ecosystem, the more edges there are, meaning that there's going to be more edges, transition zones between one type of habitat to another, like parkland to housing development or grassland to forest. And these edges actually increase chances for species to come into contact with stuff that's potentially harmful, potentially other species. An example of this is the brown-headed cowbird. The brown-headed cowbird is a nest parasite. They do not build their own nests. They lay their eggs in the nest of other species and basically trick that species into raising their young. So the brown-headed cowbird thrives in these edges, these transition zones between fragmented habitats, but the species that they're using to rely on to raise their young do not. So these nest parasites are getting a advantage by habitat fragmentation, and their species that they're using, their host species, are not getting that same advantage. Native species are species that live in their historical range. They're well adapted to their environments and they function properly within the trophic structure of the ecosystem. Exotic or alien species are species that live outside of their historic range. They often outcompete native species for niche space because they have no natural predators within an ecosystem. Species can be moved outside of their historical range and become exotic or alien either purposefully or accidentally. There's lots and lots of cases of species being transported both purposefully and accidentally. The one that we've studied a lot here in apes purposefully is cane toads in Australia, but there's lots of other examples. Please be familiar with those examples, hint, hint. And then there are species that move accidentally. Rats were introduced to Hawaii accidentally on sailing ships that landed there during the days of sail exploration. Fire ants came accidentally to the United States on a shipment of pallet wood from Brazil in the 1950s. Nobody meant to introduce rats to Hawaii or meant to introduce fire ants to, in this case, the port of Mobile, Alabama. But it happened accidentally because they were on board something that was moving between those two areas. In this case, both ships. When exotic or alien species spread rapidly across large areas, we call them invasive species. Examples include kudzu vine, zebra or quagga mussels, the Asian silver carp, and about 10,000,000 others. Again, please, in preparation for your exam and for your quizzes, you need to have a good mental list of invasive species. Hunting, fishing, and harvesting affect wild populations of plants and animals, and extreme forms of these activities can actually lead to extinction. Legal and illegal trade in plants and animals can lead to species decline. So let's talk a little bit about 3 pieces of legislation that are designed to mitigate species decline due to legal and illegal trade. The Lacey Act, which was enacted in the year 1900, so one of our first pieces of legislation. It prohibited interstate shipping of illegally harvested plants and animals. It's still in effect. You can still be in violation of the Lacey Act. This was actually enacted. People are like, oh, it's like the predecessor to the Endangered Species Act. No, it's not. It was basically enacted for economic reasons. They didn't want, as the West was opening up and new Western states were being admitted to the Union, they didn't want poachers to be going out to the Western states and taking bounty animals such as wolves and taking those hides and those furs and taking them back to the East Coast for sale. They wanted the Western states wanted to keep the profits for that, for those bounty species in their own territories. So it was actually enacted for economic reasons. However, it had the effect of forcing bounty hunters to get licensed by the U.S. government and stopping illegal harvesting and interstate trade. CITES, C-I-T-E-S, enacted in 1973. It was an international treaty, still is an international treaty, designed to control international trade in threatened plants and animals. When we watched the movie about the manta rays, that included they were trying to get the manta rays on the CITES list of threatened plants and animals. The Endangered Species Act, also 1973. This is a U.S. law designed to protect threatened and endangered plants and animals and their habitats. And we'll talk more about that as the presentation continues. Pollutants can also lead to a loss of biodiversity. Pesticides can lead to bioaccumulation and biomagnification. And depending on the pesticide, those can cause all kinds of harm. They can cause direct death or they can cause reproductive harm. Heavy metals can cause neurological and organ damage. Acidic precipitation can cause tissue damage in plants and reproductive harm in other species. Endocrine disruptors can cause reproductive harm. Eutrophication can cause low dissolved oxygen, which leads to species death. Thermal pollution can cause thermal shock and directly can cause death if the temperature swing is too great. And last but not least, climate change threatens species and their habitats worldwide. Okay, so we talked about biodiversity is declining. We talked about why biodiversity is declining. Now we're going to talk about how do we conserve biodiversity. Well, generally, our conservation approach has taken a single species approach, meaning that we try to save one species at a time. There's pros and cons to this, right? So how do you save one species at a time? Well, you can provide additional habitat for that species. You can reduce harvesting of that species, or you can remediate contamination that might be impairing the survival of the species. Meaning if pollution is hurting the species, you can actually clean up the pollution so that the species is going to have a better chance at survival. When a population has declined to critical levels, the remaining individuals are often captured and brought into captivity to be bred and then hopefully reintroduced to the wild. An example of success with captive breeding programs has been the California condor. In 1987, only 22 birds of the California condor species remained. They were all captured and they were put into a captive breeding program. Their habitat was also remediated. There was some problems with their habitat in California. They cleaned up their habitat. They raised the birds in captivity. And now, in 2013, there are now more than 400 birds, and most of those have been successfully introduced back into the wild. Their habitat was cleaned up, and they were captively bred in an environment to increase their chances of survival. And this was a success story. Not all species actually do well with breeding in captivity, however, so it's kind of controversial. Legislation on the conservation of biodiversity. The first one you need to know is the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972. This prohibits the killing of all marine mammals in the U.S. and U.S. waters, and it prohibits the import and export of marine mammal body parts. Mammals. Not fish, but marine mammals. So we're talking anything, like seals, dolphins, other types of porpoises, whales. Can't kill them in U.S. waters, can't import or export their body parts. The Endangered Species Act of 1973. It authorizes the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to designate species as threatened or endangered. So when we talk about endangered species, remember there's that IUCN list versus the endangered species list, two different things. And it prohibits the harming of listed species, including prohibitions on trade in fur and body parts. Because this act limits human activities in habitat areas of threatened or endangered species, particularly land developers and real estate developers will often pit short-term economic interests against the survival of the endangered or threatened species for political gain. They'll do a lot of political lobbying. They'll say the area is going to lose jobs if the area is not developed where their threatened or endangered species is. So a lot of times land that's being protected under the Endangered Species Act, there's a lot of lawsuits and litigation that goes along with that. CITES or CITES, C-I-T-E-S, again, we've talked about that before, 1973. It's an international treaty designed to control the international trade in threatened plants and animals. Now, again, you have to lobby the governing body to get a plant or animal placed on this list. And there's a bunch of member countries to this treaty, and everybody's got to ratify and approve it. So you may or may not get what you want in terms of conservation of your species on the list. All right, the Convention on Biological Diversity happened in 1992. It's an international treaty designed to conserve biodiversity, sustainably use biodiversity, and equitably share the benefits that emerge from the commercial use of genetic resources sourced from wildlands, things like pharmaceutical drugs. So in 2002, the strategic goals of this international treaty were reevaluated, and they were reevaluated again in 2010. Both of those reassessments indicated a significant downward trend in biodiversity worldwide, meaning that the goals of the legislation have not been met. So this has largely not been a successful international treaty. Okay, so we talked again about the fact that we tend to do single species approach to the conservation of biodiversity. Find a species that's threatened or endangered, do what we need to do in order to get it off that list or to fix the problem. However, there's another way to think about conservation of biodiversity, and that's the ecosystem approach to conservation. The ecosystem approach recognizes the benefit of preserving particular regions of the world. We call these biodiversity hotspots. The ecosystem approach is a motivating factor in the development of things like national parks and marine reserves. Since the 1960s, the amount of protected land has been increasing worldwide. That's a good thumbs up. Thank you, world. Factors to consider when conserving ecosystems include the proposed size of the protected area, also the shape of that conservation area, and its ability to connect with other protected areas in order to enhance and preserve genetic flow within the species that are within the protected areas. If you don't allow for some kind of genetic flow between protected areas, you end up with inbreeding, depression, and other kinds of genetic issues. All right, so let's talk about the size, shape, and connectedness of a protected area. Back in the day, back in chapter 6, we talked about the theory of island biogeography. This was an idea that examined how the size of an island and its distance from the mainland influenced its biodiversity. The larger the island, the larger the biodiversity. The closer to the mainland, the larger the biodiversity. So the further from the mainland, the less biodiversity. Conservation areas are technically islands of biodiversity that are surrounded by less hospitable environments. So this theory of island biogeography actually goes along with these conservation islands. Decisions on how much land or which land to conserve must be based upon the unique needs of the ecosystem and the species involved. And there's this term called SLOSS, SLOSS. That means single, large, or several small areas. And again, each conservation decision is unique. Should you set aside a single large preserve or several smaller preserves where species can have conservation corridors between them? And it just depends, your decision depends upon what's best for what species you're trying to conserve. Okay, idea of metapopulations. Metapopulations are a collection of smaller, relatively isolated populations of a species that are connected by an occasional dispersal of individuals along habitat corridors. Metapopulations would go along with the idea of several small conservation areas rather than one large conservation area. So if you can't, for whatever reason, afford, or if it's not the best in the species' best interest to have one large area, you can set aside several small areas that are connected by these habitat corridors, so the species can move within these protected habitats and still maintain genetic flow. Okay, so edge habitat. We talked about the brown-headed cowbird, and we're going to talk about it again. An edge habitat is where two distinct communities and ecosystems come together, forming these abrupt transition zones. Examples would be the transition between a grassy mowed field to a forest, or from human settlement to parkland. And there's, lots of other types of transition zones, but those are just two examples. Some species benefit from increased edge habitat, like the brown-headed cowbird that we talked about earlier, but a lot of species suffer from that. The greater the number of edges in their habitat, the more they can come into contact with potential hazards and other potential hazardous species. Biosphere reserves. Biosphere reserves are UNESCO protected areas consisting of zones that vary in the amount of permissible human impact. So what's UNESCO? UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It's made up, it's basically an international organization that preserves educational, scientific, and cultural sites around the globe. So this idea of a biosphere reserve is something that UNESCO came up with. There's 3 zones within a biosphere reserve. The outermost zone is called the transition zone. The transition zone permits things like sustainable logging, sustainable agriculture, and low impact human settlement. It's still within the reserve, but you're transitioning from the everyday activities, the human activities in the larger cultural context into a biosphere reserve. So you have only sustainable logging, only sustainable agriculture, and low impact human settlement, which might be different outside of that transition zone. The second zone in is called the buffer zone. The buffer zone is the central zone of the reserve, and it protects the most sensitive areas and permits tourism, environmental education, and scientific research. So we've got this buffer zone that's buffering between the transition where humans are allowed to settle and do kind of humany things like logging and agriculture. Now we get a buffer that's buffering the core, right? Humans can still be there. You can do tourism, you can do environmental education, you can do scientific research, but you can't settle there. There's no long-term human settlement in that area. The innermost zone of a biosphere reserve is called the core zone. It is the most ecologically sensitive area, and it receives minimal human impact, and it is the site of the most concentrated area of biodiversity in the reserve. So this is the area that you don't want humans to be traipsing through, you don't want human impact on. Now, there may be occasional scientific expeditions into this area to study things, to see what's going on, but there's no long-term scientific research. Like, you're not setting up a research station there. People are not living there for any length of time. It's basically nature as nature was designed to be left. If you didn't know, we have a biosphere reserve here in Texas, and that is Big Bend National Park. They have a transition zone, a buffer zone, and a core zone in Big Bend. There are many areas in Big Bend that you cannot get to unless you hike there with your own two tootsies. And there's lots and lots of biodiversity conservation that are going on there. I have been there. It is amazing. So I would encourage you to go if you get a chance.